When The Sound of Music opened in 1965, the world saw Maria and Captain Von Trapp fall in love on screen. But what audiences never forgot was the spark between Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews, the kind of chemistry that felt too natural to be acting. For years, they laughed off the rumors. People began to wonder if their story had continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. From the moment they met, something clicked. Crew members later said it was instant, the way they moved together in rehearsal scenes as if they'd known each other for years. Their very differences, her optimism and his dry humor, created a tension that felt alive. When cameras rolled, that spark transferred effortlessly to film. It wasn't practiced or rehearsed, it was simply there, between them. During early shoots in the Austrian countryside, they often spent hours waiting for light or weather to cooperate. Between takes, they'd sit at a piano, trading songs or teasing each other over forgotten lines. It was playful, but beneath it ran something quieter: admiration. The film's famous ballroom scene captured that tension perfectly. As the captain takes Maria's hand and leads her into a dance, something shifts. The music slows, their eyes lock, and for a moment, the rest of the room disappears. That wasn't acting. Plummer later admitted that the emotion he felt in that scene startled him. That it wasn't just the character losing control but himself. He didn't say it publicly then, but the people watching that day saw it. The smile, the stillness, the subtle intake of breath before the dance begins. It was real. Julie, for her part, carried herself with quiet grace throughout the production. She never blurred the line between fiction and life, yet she seemed to understand the tenderness that hung unspoken between them. The crew often described how their energy changed when they were together: lighter, more focused, even mischievous. By the time shooting wrapped, their dynamic had become the heart of The Sound of Music. What began as simple casting had turned into the kind of cinematic pairing that people would talk about for generations. For Julie, the boundaries were clear. She was a wife and mother, with a public image built on grace. For Christopher, the temptation to break that boundary came with equal fear: fear of scandal, of misunderstanding, of losing the very friendship that grounded him. When production ended, their parting was bittersweet. He kissed her hand lightly, and she smiled with the restraint of someone who knows what can never be said. Their connection had crossed into something undefined. Not romance, not friendship, but an intimacy that lived in the spaces between. Years turned into decades. Marriages came and went. Successes and failures piled up. Yet each time they crossed paths, a film festival, an award ceremony, a quiet dinner in New York, something old and unspoken returned. Witnesses recalled that the room always seemed to pause when they embraced, as if time itself hesitated to interrupt. He would joke, she would laugh, and then there'd be that small silence, the same pause from the dance hall in Salzburg, still echoing 40 years later. He once admitted that he had great affection for her, the kind that never asked for anything in return. It was the most he ever said publicly, but his eyes betrayed a deeper truth. Those who knew him privately said he often kept a still from the film in his study, the moment where their faces nearly touch under the soft light. He never explained why. Julie carried the same loyalty. Through the losses that marked her later years, she spoke of Christopher as her dearest friend. People close to her said she never let anyone speak of him dismissively. To her, he wasn't the gruff co-star or the difficult perfectionist some described. He was the man who had seen her at her most vulnerable, when she was young, uncertain, and balancing fame with family. Even after 50 years, the memory of that first connection seemed untouched. When the film reached its golden anniversary, the two reunited on stage. The audience cheered, but they hardly noticed. They clasped hands, smiling at each other, with that same familiar tenderness. There was no performance in that moment. No lines, no cameras, no characters. Only two lives that had intersected once, impossibly, and never quite drifted apart. He later said those reunions felt like coming home. She said simply, "We never stopped being close." Behind the careful words lay a truth neither could ever fully share, that some bonds are meant to last quietly, surviving not through possession, but through memory. And for both of them, memory was enough. The Sound of Music was no longer just a film, it was an era, preserved in song and memory. Each anniversary brought new interviews, retrospectives, and inevitably questions about the magic between them. Every time a reporter brought up their chemistry, Julie would smile, tilt her head, and say something modest like, "We just adored each other." Christopher would grin, calling her too perfect, and joking that he had fallen in love with Maria, not Julie. But behind the humor, there was something unguarded in his tone, as if the years had worn down his defenses. In private, he spoke of her differently. Friends recalled that her name came up often, especially after a glass of wine and an old song playing in the background. He'd describe her as the rarest kind of woman, one you admire too much to risk losing. It was the sort of confession that never made headlines but stayed with the people who heard it. When asked why he never pursued her, he would shake his head and say, "Because what we had was untouched, and I wanted it to stay that way." Julie, too, held her silence carefully. She'd endured heartbreak and loss, a marriage that faded, the death of her husband, Blake Edwards. And yet, whenever Christopher's name appeared in conversation, her face lit up. As they grew older, they appeared together more often. Award ceremonies, tributes, charity events. The affection between them was unmistakable. Their friendship had outlasted rumors, marriages, and time itself. What began as chemistry had become constancy, something so steady, so quiet, it no longer needed explanation. When asked once more, late in life, if anything had ever happened between them, Christopher only smiled and said, "Everything that needed to." And with that, he left the question hanging in the air, an answer that said more than words ever could. Friends noticed it immediately. They said he spoke of Julie Andrews as though she were a memory that still lived beside him. When a biographer asked him what The Sound of Music had really meant to him, he paused for a long moment before answering. He admitted that for decades he had joked about the film, pretending to resent its sweetness. But the truth, he said, was that it had given him something he could never replace: Julie's presence. She was the heart, he said quietly. The film worked because of her, and because she made me better. It was a confession stripped of performance, spoken not as a star, but as a man nearing the end of his story. Julie remained equally loyal. Even as the years took their toll, she carried that friendship with quiet grace. When Christopher fell ill, she sent letters, flowers, and later, messages that his wife would read aloud by his bedside. One of his caretakers remembered him smiling when he heard her name, whispering, "Tell her she was my favorite." It wasn't grand or dramatic, just the final truth from a man who had spent a lifetime guarding his heart. When news of his passing came in early 2021, Julie's statement was brief but heavy with meaning. "The world has lost a consummate actor," she said, "and I have lost a cherished friend." For those who knew the history between them, those words carried the echo of something more. She didn't need to elaborate. Her grief spoke volumes, not the grief of romance, but of a soul who had found its mirror once and never again. They spoke on screen, but in the glances, the laughter, and the silences that said everything.